doing justice here and there, but a lot of us here are law students, a lot of us here are law professors, and I think the question, how does a passion for justice get passed on from generation to generation? Maybe how does it even get started with our generation is an important one to raise. And I'm hoping that this can be a session when we can be candid. To be candid, I teach law school very much like I was taught law school. I think we tend to just imitate what we've seen around us. I hope our Pepperdine law students and any other law students that may be with us might be candid even about weaknesses that they've seen in law school. I'll start with a story that maybe everybody here has heard. If not, maybe this story needs to get passed on to the next generation. But I remember when I was a law student in the mid-'70s, it had some popularity. And that was that there was a professor, very much a classic Kingsfield type professor, called on people, had them stand, grilled them, called on a student, and asked about some subject, maybe some of the subjects that we've been talking about today, the learned hand formula, duty of corporations to maximize shareholder recovery. And the student was just struck by the unfairness of whatever rule it was that the professor was mentioning. And his response was, well, but that would be unfair. And the professor's response was, well, Mr. Smith, if you came to law school to talk about fairness and injustice, you've come to the wrong place. You should have gone to the seminary, which is right across on the other side of campus. Hopefully, law school will be a place where you can and will talk about justice. Our panel's going to address that concern. Our first two speakers are actually the ones that suggested this topic to us. Initially, I thought, well, we don't have enough people to make a panel. Where am I going to squeeze you to? But then I thought, this should be what this conference is all about. This would be a great concluding panel. And so I've supplemented the panel a bit. But Nat Gant and Lynn Marie Combe, professors at Regent Law School, will be starting first. And then Timothy Floyd will speak. We've already heard from Tim. Tim wrote or edited what's really a groundbreaking book from several years ago called Can a Good Christian Be a Good Lawyer? I found many of the essays in it to be influential in my own life. And then Barb Armacost is going to speak. We've met her, but I'm going to tell a little story about Barb to introduce our panel. I think I may have already mentioned that Barb and I were friends in the mid-'70s when she was a young young nurse in Charlottesville, and I had just started practicing law, my first year of law practice. We had a group of just people who are still dear friends. Barb then went on to seminary, went to Regent, not University in Virginia, but Regent College in Vancouver, and then the law school, did an amazing job there, and then has been a professor at UVA for several years. But she told me the following story, and I'm going to add to that story. She said that after teaching at UVA Law School for several years, having been a nurse previously, having done missions work as a nurse previously, she began to think that she might renew her nursing license so that then she could go on a medical missions trip to another country. She just didn't feel like she was doing sufficient service where she was. So she's working in that direction. Gary Haugen, who kicked off our conference, came and spoke at UVA and talked about how historically the church has been very involved in evangelism and in medical missions over work. But with all the discussion in the Bible about justice, why aren't we involved in justice work overseas? Well, Barb got involved with, I checked with her, she wasn't going to tell you this story. I'm not stealing her story. So Barb got involved with IJM, did some work in India, took some students over there. She came and she told that story at one of the early Nootbaar conferences several years ago. In the back of the room was a student who slipped in for the conference, a guy named Jay Milbrandt. Jay, from Minnesota, intent was to go back and run the family business. He had an MBA, and he got inspired and started what is now, in its present form, our Global Justice Program. Jay started hassling this guy up here, Jim Gash, and saying, you got to go overseas with us. Jim Gash had no interest in that work at all. He just signally zero. But eventually, Jay sort of hammered him, convinced him to go overseas, and it's become the passion of his life. He's been to Uganda, how many times, Jim? 17 times in the last, the last few years, doing stuff that, boy, you should read Jim's book, see our movie Remand. I just say that to say that, justice is something that's taught. There's a genealogy to it. I don't know that these things wouldn't have happened had it not started with Gary Haugen, to Barb Armerkos, to Jay Milbrandt, to Jim Gash, to a lot of other folks. Jim Gash to Michael Scaperlanda, who couldn't be at this conference because he's taking Oklahoma students to Uganda for spring break this weekend. But anyway, justice is something that's taught, and what we want to do in this last session is to wrestle with how it might be done and how it might be done better. With that, we start off with Lynn.
Thank you, Bob, very much. So, thank you to the guy up there that just fixed my computer. Wow, that was really nice. So, hello. Thank you, Bob. But you know who I really want to thank? Jenna. Can we thank Jenna? Did she do everything? Not even here. Anyway.
She's not here because she's in India with a group of students.
Oh, she is. Oh, my goodness. All right. So give me a second. I am not a millennial. But somehow I raised 2 millennials. And we're going to talk about that today with this. So we're really happy to be here to bring some maybe practical points to this wonderful conference, some application points for law professors and law students alike. In fact, it's been funny throughout the weekend noticing the law students all gravitate to the practical stuff and the law professors all gravitate to the non-practical stuff. So it's been pretty funny. But anyway, we've decided to entitle our talk, Teaching Millennial Law Students to Love Justice. And I have with me an expert in teaching law students, especially ethical avenues of loving justice. So Nat will follow up from me. But what do we mean by teaching millennials justice? Well, who are we talking about? First of all, who is a millennial? It's generally someone that was born between 1982 and 2004. Yes, the whole front row right here. And the third row maybe. So anyway, it's those folks. They are just usually are surprised to go, oh, I'm a millennial? That's me? Huh? Really? In fact, some of you sitting here might say, I didn't think about what generation I am. Those of us who are boomers and Gen Xers are all very aware of our generational problems and flaws. And for the next 20 years, we, Gen Xers and boomers, are going to be teaching millennials. So that kind of makes it a little more interesting. A guy named Elwood Carlson wrote a book about millennials called The Lucky Few. And what he said there was that millennials are, quote, the new boomers, because there was a rise in birth rates in 1983 that have continued. But millennials are also called sometimes the 9/11 generation, because that has defined your lives. It has really defined the political and social challenges that we've faced since that terrorist attack. There have been persistent economic difficulties since then, and it's really changed your lives in that regard, changed the lives of millennials. In fact, millennials tend to call themselves things like, in negative terms, like self-absorbed or wasteful or greedy. I have 2 kids who are millennials. My generation is just greedy. That's what they say. In these slides, you're going to see millennials wrote both of the articles I'm citing here, and they call themselves screwed. Now, how did that happen? Why would millennials think that about themselves? Well, these slides focus on the fact that millennials feel like they have gotten the shaft because of all the economic problems. The previous slide, that deals with 10 reasons. All 10 are economic problems. They feel like they're loaded down with all kinds of economic issues. This slide shows 4 big ones. They've not known anything much but a recession. We've never had good economic times in the lives of millennials, especially since they can remember. They're loaded down with student loan debt, they can't get a job, and they're stuck living in mom's basement. But, like the slide says, 76% of college-age millennials say the economy is one of the most important issues, but they're suffering under it. They're suffering under this economy. So they're focused on the negative aspects of economics, as these slides indicate, but there's also this glimmer of hope, and this is from a millennial, a quote from a millennial directly. The choices we make in our early adulthood, both personally and politically, could change the game for our generation and the one after us. What do you hear in that? You hear passion, don't you? You hear somebody that, I'm not going to put up with this. Even though maybe I think I've been given the shaft, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to do what I can. So what happens? Bernie Sanders. That has been a lot of what has motivated his success. Look at his little sign, a future to believe in. He has really gotten college students all over the country. Maybe because free stuff, free college, I don't know. But he's kind of represents hope to millennials. But there are some other things about millennials you should know about. They are the most racially diverse generation in all of American history. Most racially diverse. Well, who is it? Someone who said there was 70 languages down in LA. That was fascinating.
One school. In
one school. Millennials are also the most highly educated of any generation in American history. So, yet, they can't get jobs. There are fewer millennials employed now than there ever has been. They are, however, very well connected with their use of technology. I am positive it was a millennial that just figured out how to turn on my computer when I couldn't. They're multitaskers, and they live through social media. You're all smiling, because you know this is you. You live through social media. In fact, when I was sitting in the back earlier this morning, and there were 4 millennials sitting in front of me, they all were taking really great notes on whatever was being spoken about, but they all had Facebook conversations opened as well. One person had 2, another person had 4, and then another person had 8 Facebook conversations open while she's taking notes. Anyway.
Who is this now?
It was fascinating. But I teach and publish in family law, and what has been most fascinating to me has been the millennial intersection with marriage. What is happening is that the rate for marriage has dropped for millennials dramatically. Only 20% of all millennials are married, from what was close to 60% of Gen Xers and baby boomers. Yet, look at the far right statistic. 90% of millennials want to be married. So what is this disconnect? They're not marrying, they want to be married. What's going on here? And even when they do marry, as this slide shows, they wait till they're almost 30 to do so. So they're very unique. It's almost like, oh, is this part of them having gotten the shaft? Well, the short answer is really the deconstruction of the family. We, boomers and millennials, really started it with the high divorce rates. And the high divorce rates peaked right around the millennial generation started, and they've dropped a little bit, which has been good, but look, still, they are living in a different family setup than we were. We boomers and Gen Xers have fully implemented family deconstruction, not only with these high divorce rates, but also with the normalization of family fragmentation. It's very non-stigmatized now to never have formed a family with marriage or to, go ahead and have a divorce. It's not a big deal anymore. In fact, this is an article. I'm not as shy as Jennifer was about SSRN. You can actually link to our article on my SSRN page. And we co-authored, my co-author's right in the back. She's also a millennial. And we co-authored this 50-state survey on the cost of family fragmentation. So millennials are really caught in the midst of this. And it's all about economics and the cost of that, and the millennials are experiencing those effects. And the result is it's more normal to not be married. In fact, it's more normal to parent than to be married. Almost 50% of children born today are born without having mom and dad married to each other. But something interesting happened this summer. I taught a course in Oxford called Law, Economics, Literature, and Marriage. And it was really a blast. All we did was look at Jane Austen literature and laws in England and America over 300 years on marriage. And we saw how money has impacted marriage, because that's what all this is really about. So here, the reason why I'm having you look at Elizabeth Bennet is because I started beginning to see this past summer that millennials are a lot like Elizabeth Bennet. Now think about her. She's idealistic, but direct. She's opinionated and a bit judgmental, but she's willing to adjust her judgment when she gets all the information. And while she thinks she's not driven by money, it's not so bad to fall in love with a rich guy, right? Indeed, in my research now, I have learned that the most important thing a woman is looking for in a guy is not good looks or a hot body. Do you know what it is? A job. Girls want men with jobs. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? I think there's hope. There is a lot of hope. Millennials can be discipled, loved, trained as strong individuals, as lawyers. They can be passionate, compassionate. They can be focused like no generation ever has been, because they understand that they are the beginning of the future. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Nat Gant, and he's going to tell you the rest of the story.
Thank you, Len. So where does that leave us in terms of how do we teach millennials to love justice? We've heard a lot about the way millennials think about things. Let me talk about one quick objection that I was thinking about even in putting this presentation together. Is Len mentioned, don't millennials already love justice? Aren't they concerned about justice? Well, that is a true statement if you look at some of the research, but it overlooks the fact that as legal education, we destroy that love of justice pretty regularly through the traditional legal education process. And there's actually a lot of research out there that says that law students actually enter law school pretty highly motivated by internal values, by this idea to pursue justice, to make a change in the world. But over time, definitely by their third year, they're much more externally motivated by grades, getting a good job, impressing other people. So there's something that happens in this three or 4 years of legal education that actually destroys that millennial drive. So we need to make some changes as legal educators. Now, one of my research areas is this whole idea of professional identity. How many of you have heard the term professional identity in the room? Okay, good. So this is something that's gotten a lot of play, in a sense, in legal education circles. And essentially what this is that as law schools, we need to do more than helping you as students think like a lawyer, more than just teaching you skills like writing skills or research skills. We actually need to help you to develop a professional identity, develop character. And this report called the Carnegie Report came out in 2007 that says, as law schools, we're doing a horrible job at that. Horrible job. So how can we do a better job at that? I think part of this responsibility that we have to teach you to love justice is related to helping you as law students to develop a professional identity. So what are some practical ways? So I'll end with this, kind of practical tips that we can use as legal educators to inspire law students to love justice. The first one is that we need to, I think, as professors, and many of us are professors in the room, is to reconceive really who we think we are as professors. And not see ourselves as teachers, even though it's part of what we do, but see ourselves as mentors. So the research says that millennials thrive on relationships and collaboration. They desire to have relationships with our faculty members in ways that in my generation, Generation X, many of us did not. And so I think that changes the way we see our role as professors. And in fact, in reflecting on this a little bit more, I look back at my faculty assessment. So Lynn is our associate dean, and the assessment that I sent her a few weeks ago. And actually at Regent, we are to evaluate ourselves on teaching and mentoring. Teaching and mentoring, that's one of our criteria for evaluating ourselves. So I think that we need to change the way we view ourselves as professors in terms of inspiring and encouraging our students. So I wrote, do we educate or do we encourage and inspire? Am I an inspirer as a professor, or am I just disseminating content? And mentoring can also model empathy. So the research talks about that it's important when we want to develop a professional identity that we develop empathy so that we can be a good decision maker. If we can, as professors, be a good role model, a good mentor to our students, we can model empathy, we can model other-centeredness. So I think we need to ask ourselves as professors, are we doing that? And of course this takes time. We've got articles to write and classes to teach. I'm not saying that we need to go out and mentor 50 students, but we need to, I think, reconceive our day in a way to where mentoring is part of that. Second practical tip is tell stories. So Bob already modeled that in telling stories. And putting this together, it really made me think, how many stories do I tell when I teach? We go through the cases, right? We call on students, we ask them the rules. But how many stories do we tell? And we need to show them that there are examples of modern day lawyer heroes. And Gary Haugen mentioned this yesterday, kind of indirectly when we talked about there's a need for the modern day heroic. There are many lawyers out there doing tremendous things. And we need to model that in terms of teaching. Are we telling stories? And these don't have to be our own stories. They can be stories of other lawyers that we see. Stories of what Jim Gash is doing in Uganda. Stories that, of other lawyers that are making a tremendous difference. Third, we need to provide feedback through experience. So mentors love millennials love feedback. And feedback needs to be more than just giving them a midterm. But how can we take them in their first year, for example, and give them experiences that take the lessons that they're learning that first year already and give them some feedback about how they can apply what they're learning in concrete and real ways. And then lastly, we need to inspire them to make a difference. Inspire students to make a difference. So I thought about this yesterday when there was a discussion about the justice gap. And I have a quick story to share about that. So in my professional responsibility class, we read a section on the prevalence of the justice gap in our country. And several of the students came up to me as part of our discussion and said, these are second semester, second year students. So these are not brand new first year students, and said, we didn't know about this. We didn't know there was a justice gap. And I think we need to do a better job of encouraging our students and telling them that as lawyers, you can make a difference. We hear so much about there's so many lawyers in this country. We overlook the fact that there's a tremendous need for lawyers in this country. And so we need to encourage our students to think about that way and let them to know they can make a difference in the legal profession. Thank you.
What they said. Teaching law students to love justice. You notice the language that Bob used here? He didn't say teaching students to analyze justice or to understand justice or teaching students about justice, even appreciate justice, but love justice. I attend a lot of bar association meetings. I've been to, 50 law school graduations over the years. I've heard lots of speakers praise justice in their talks. I've been that speaker myself a few times, and I got to tell you, I think it's always boring. Maybe there's an exception or two, but usually in those occasions where there are speakers that talk about how great our justice system is and isn't American justice wonderful, it just falls flat. So that's my first lesson. Making speeches is not the way to engender a love of justice. In fact, I fear a little bit when I'm at some of these, even when I'm the one doing the speaking, that God despises our festivals and our celebrations and takes no delight in our solemn assemblies. Y'all know the quote, of course. That's from Amos. You know what comes next, right? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. One of my favorite books is by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on the prophets. I recommend that book. It's probably 50 years old now, but it's still great. Heschel insists that Amos's image of a rushing, ever-flowing stream is a better image of justice than the traditional statue with the scales and the blindfold. And why is that? Because the scales are static. You know, there's advantages to that. The blindfold implies neutrality. There's the even-handed weighing, but it's static, and it's sort of backwards looking. This rushing waters image is dynamic, and it can bring about change. That's what it's all about. Heschel said, moralists of all ages sing the praises of justice, but the prophets are marked by their relentless inveighing against injustice. Injustice is what the prophets really were about. I mean, people often say the biblical prophets insisted on justice, but what got them worked up was injustice, which is my second lesson. I really think if we want to get students moved about justice issues, a little bit of passion, maybe even a little bit of anger about injustice is the entree to do that. Students do respond to injustice more than justice. You know, the central story of the Hebrew scriptures, the Exodus, the God of the Bible is not some static, eternal, unchanging, Platonic kind of ideal. God is an active participant really throughout the Hebrew Bible, but in the Exodus, God hears the suffering of the children of Israel in their oppression and in their slavery, and God decides, that's not right, I'm going to do something about it. That's our model, which really leads to my third lesson. How can we get students to see injustice, to hear the cries of those who are suffering under oppression? Well, we have to put them out there in the world where it is. And so I am convinced that law school needs to have much more in the way of clinics and externships and other real-world experiential education. I've been singing this song for a long time. I've spent much of my career in legal education as a clinician and teaching externships, and it serves all kinds of other great purposes about teaching students skills and instilling professional identity. But it's also the best way for students to really get a passion about justice, because when my students are out there working in the real world, wherever they are, if they're in the prosecutor's office, they get outraged about how the victims aren't protected. If they're in the public defender office, they get outraged about the treatment of their clients. If they're in the civil legal services office, they learned about the justice gap. I don't have to have them read anything. They see it face to face. So real world education is absolutely essential. Those are my three lessons. I have one more note here, which take this for what it's worth, but I have a particular problem with some of my Christian students on this. It really ties into something that was said this morning that some Christians believe, and that is that justice is the norm of the Old Testament, but it's been superseded by the New Testament and the emphasis on love and on grace. And so what I'm saying is, I think there's some students think, well, justice, that's Old Testament. I'm a Christian and I'm all about grace and love. And I say, well, that's wonderful. I am too. But this distinction between Old Testament justice on the one hand and New Testament love and grace on the other is false. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous because, anti-Judaism is our original sin as Christians. And thinking that our Jewish older brothers and sisters in the faith are somehow less than we are, I think, is a problem. And it's led to all kinds of other issues. But it's also false. I mean, if you read our Bible, and I say our as a Christian, which includes, of course, an Old Testament and a New Testament, it's just not accurate to say that justice is somehow, just legalistic and doesn't include grace and include love. The justice of the Old Testament is really restorative, it's reconciling, it has a purpose toward shalom and well-being. And Jesus doesn't supersede that. That's the justice, as we heard this morning, that Jesus preaches. That's the justice that Jesus embodies. And so, at least for some of my Christian students, I have to go through a little bit of that and make sure that they understand that when we talk about justice, we're not just talking about some dry legalism and judgmentalism. We're talking about a dynamic passion and emphasis to bring about God's wholeness and healing, and really the kingdom on earth. Thanks.
You guys are probably all exhausted out there. But let me just say, before I say anything, and I'm not going to say a whole lot, is that I think Bob's purpose in this panel was not to set us up as experts by any means, but to start a conversation. So I hope that during the question time, we can make it more of a you tell us what you do time too, so that we can really learn from each other. I want to share 3 ways in which I try to teach my students to love justice. And they're loosely brought together by the notion of helping students see things they wouldn't ordinarily see, and hoping that seeing will bring empathy, because I think empathy is an entree into justice. You're not going to treat a person with respect and treat them justly if you don't have empathy. And so part of what I'm trying to do by these 3 things is to help my students have empathy. So as first-year teachers, we tell students that what we're trying to do is teach them to think like lawyers. And I realized along the way they have no idea what that means. And I have no idea what they think we mean by that. So I decided to start asking them. So now, about halfway through my torts semester, first year, I have a whole class in which we talk about thinking like a lawyer. And so I start out by saying to them, what do you think it means to think like a lawyer? And they say things like, it means seeing both sides, it means asking questions, it means using facts, it means not assuming there's a right answer. And those are all perfectly good ways to describe what we've been doing in torts class. So I quite often divide the class in half and have this side be the plaintiff and this side be the defendant, and I have them give me all the arguments. And I get mad at them if they can't figure out what the arguments for the defendant are because they think the plaintiff ought to win, right? So what we're trying to do is get them to learn to make arguments. And we're trying to teach them that in some ways lawyering is more about arguments than it is about the bottom line. And we're trying to educate them out of a habit they came in with, which is I'm going to think about which side I think ought to win, and I'm not going to be very good at figuring out the arguments on the other side. So we're trying to get them to exercise their argument muscles. But in this particular class, I use 3 stories to try to push them in a slightly different direction. So one story is from the movie Gideon versus Wainwright. It's a wonderful movie. Henry Fonda plays Gideon. And the movie is wonderful because one clip of the movie shows the case where Gideon is representing himself, and it's such a disaster, but it's a wonderful disaster to see. I mean, it's really, and then you see the case with the lawyer. And so then we talk about, what did the lawyer do? What difference did the lawyer make? Then I also tell them a story about a Haitian human rights lawyer who was imprisoned in Haiti, and the International Justice Mission got him out. And the way they did it is just absolutely inspiring. And then I tell them a story that's closer to my heart, which is the story of a young African-American man who was a friend of my sister's. She had kind of helped to get him out of the homeless shelter, and he was doing really well and had a job. He got arrested for a crime he couldn't possibly have committed. But, he's a young black man with dreadlocks, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so we got him a lawyer because we were worried that he was going to end up frying for a case for something he didn't do. So, in telling those stories, what I'm trying to remind my students is sometimes there really is a right side and a wrong side. That is, our adversary system tells us that, one side makes their arguments and the other side makes their arguments, and then the lawyer steps back and lets the judge decide. And I don't want my students to get so good at making arguments on both sides that they get out of the habit of making moral judgments. Sometimes there needs to be a moral judgment made. And students need to exercise those muscles too. And I think sometimes, even in my own classes in which I'm aware of these things, they get the sense that it's just all about making arguments, and it doesn't really matter how good or bad your arguments are. So what I tell them is, your arguments make certain policies possible. You can't just walk away from your argument and say, it doesn't matter what arguments I made. It matters, because the arguments that you make invite certain kinds of policies, make certain kinds of policies possible. The skill of lawyering, I think, is such a powerful tool. And I try to help them see that it's a powerful tool in the hands of somebody who needs to exercise it wisely. In our American system, what lawyers do makes an enormous difference. I mean, it changes what our culture looks like. And, over time, the arguments students make and the sides of the case they're on change the world. And so I say to them, when you get finished your life as a lawyer, you want to be able to say, I changed the world in good ways, not bad ways. The second thing I try to do in my first-year class is to counteract the effects of using appellate cases. So appellate cases, as you all know who teach them, we teach appellate cases because that's where the rules are. But appellate cases are sterile. They're ahistorical. They often ignore historical and human context. And in fact, you can discuss an appellate case without even identifying what the facts are. And in fact, sometimes you have to search hard in the case to find out what the facts are. So, and in torts, we blithely talk about, men being run over by trains and women being sexually assaulted and children getting run over by cars while their parents watch. These are the awful stories that happen in torts. So every once in a while, I stop in the class and I say, let's just recognize what actually happened in this case and the human misery that it represents. Now, you can't do that with every case. But by doing that, I'm trying to remind them again of what the historical and human context is of a case. This past semester, at 2 different times, I had 2 different students who came up to me after class and said, that case was really hard for me. You were talking about cancer treatment in that case, and my friend right now is going through surgery for cancer. The student wasn't telling me because they were mad at me for discussing the case. What they were doing is telling me why they were upset in the class and saying, it's nothing you said, it's just this going on. Another student came up to me after we talked about a case involving a drowning, and she said, my brother drowned, and the circumstances around his drowning were really awful. And so I think when students feel the level of comfort to come and tell me those things, it also reminds me of the humanness of the cases that we're talking about. I had a sort of a funny thing happen to me in my exam this year. I got, we grade blindly, and so I'm going along grading the exams, and I come across this one exam. I had no idea who it was. At the bottom of the page, she said, "Thank you very much for not killing off any of the plaintiffs in this exam. It made it much more pleasant." So, that's funny, and yet it made me realize, the stories that happen in torts are hard. And anyway, I thought that was quite a funny little comment. So one final example is similar. It comes from my religion clause class. That case is, or the religion clause class raises a lot of contentious issues, particularly now. And the students are coming from all different religious traditions. Some of them are very religious. Some of them are not religious at all. Some of them are atheists. Some of them are somewhat hostile toward religion. And what I try to do in that class is create a safe space where they can learn from each other. So one student says, I can't believe that a religious person would ask for that accommodation. That seems really stupid. And then another student says, actually, that accommodation is really important to me because this is what happened to me when I was a high school student. And not getting that accommodation means that I was singled out and ridiculed, right? So the students are learning from each other. Some students are educated in public schools, and some are educated in private schools, and some kids are homeschooled. Well, that gives them a much different impression of what's important or not important about religious freedom. And when they share that with each other, I feel like they go away seeing something new and having empathy toward one another. So if I can create a safe space in my classrooms where they can see new things, and by seeing new things, they can develop empathy. And from that empathy, they can love justice. That's what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
So we've got about 10 minutes. It just struck me that one of the things that, one of the good lessons from the Gary to Barb to Jay to Jim story that I told earlier is that one of the links in that chain was a student. It was Jim, it was Jay who encouraged Jim to go to Uganda and then led to much of what we do over there. So we got 10 minutes to learn from students. Any reaction to what's been said? Maybe we'll hold off and just see if students have comments either about this panel or just as you reflect on your legal education or this conference, what inspires you to justice, what deadens you to justice about law school. Teach us. Michael.
Just sort of a comment for Professor Armacost. I lost my father to a heart attack, and a criminal law professor used heart attack hypothetical, heart condition, and every time that happened, I just immediately could not listen anymore, and it really impacted me. So I appreciate you recognizing that in students and knowing that people, it's tough to hear a lot of the stuff we hear in class, and I think that's critical to effective teaching. So thank you for that.
Uh-huh.
I think that this panel really, sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I think that this panel really ties in with the speech by Brian Hippocrates yesterday about how, like he was kind of showing how, you can help in effective ways. And I really like that, and this reminds me of that because it's not just about educating or helping on the surface, but it's about inspiring and kind of like empathizing with people, creating connections, and I think that like helps bring it together for me because it shows that like there's a lot of depth to it, and there's a lot of like how important human relations and human contact is, and I think that's a good thing to keep in mind because sometimes we lose sight of that.
Uh-huh. Devaney.
I agree, actually. I think that one reason why we lose, I agree with everything separately. But I feel like the reason why we lose it is because I feel like there's only a limit to what a lawyer can do because we only think of it in the court context, and we do. I don't know. A lot of times I would hear some lawyers say, "Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you did it or if you didn't do it because you're just arguing." Facts. You lose the feeling in it. And so I feel like maybe showing the long-term effects as opposed to just sticking into the court, I guess, maybe, could help because that does remind us that it's not just about, arguing this side and this side. It's like, this can do this, this, and this. And I mean, I'm not sure if explaining what lawyers go on to do besides just in the court would help too, but I know that some people do, myself also, I do sometimes feel limited, like, okay, I'm going to be an attorney, I don't know, really, I want to do so much more than just what is done in the court, and I don't see the connection sometimes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I have a former student. She became she went to work for as a public defender doing juvenile public defense, and so she came back to talk to my class one time, and she said, so I represent my clients in court, and we'll work out, typically in juvenile court, they're not going to get thrown away for life and put in solitary. Maybe the judge could do that, but it's typically some sort of a placement that's going to be for their benefit. And she says after she's represented them, she says she has one final meeting, and she says, well, now I've handled your case. I've done the best that I could for you. What are we going to do to get your life straightened out now so this doesn't happen again? So what she does is in court's very important. It establishes the credibility for her to have that relationship. But lawyers counsel people in a whole lot of ways beyond handling their particular case. Well, why don't we open things up if other students have things they'd like to say? Let me know and you can jump right in, but yeah.
So I was on the admissions committee for a couple of years at our school, and the admissions essays very much were about students wanting to do justice. You know, they had some issue that they cared about. And I was struck by Nat's slide about students losing that over the course of law school. I wonder if, in addition to the admissions essay, we should ask, like, write a graduation essay and make them reread what they wrote when they were asking to get into law school, right? So to remind
That'd be very
themselves of
interesting.
what was inspiring them to take this path, and then reflect after 3 years, okay, reading what you said you wanted to do, what do you want to do now?
And of course, one of the dismal things that they might say is, I need to pay off my student debts. I think
That's
that,
huge.
you know, the economic pressures that young lawyers now face throws a lot of cold water on passion for justice. Yeah.
It's interesting that you said that in response to almost exactly that concern that they had lost that passion, that we do see exactly the same way. We imposed a 50-hour pro bono / community service / modest means requirement. They have different amounts of hours that they can make that up with, so that over the course of law school, they would sustain that, hopefully, they could sustain that interest and maybe carry that with them into practice.
I think that's great. I have a follow-up question for you, Sarah. Did y'all impose it on the faculty as well?
There was so much discussion of that, and no, we did not. We tried.
Wow.
Mentoring, you know.
There are, but you know what we do get? We get a lot of students coming up to professors and asking them if they do it.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
So that's enough, that's a little bit of pressure.
And if I could just add, I think that the economics certainly play into it, as Lynn was saying. I do think it's more than that, though. It's just this culture of, again, the research talks about external motivation, that your worth is based on your GPA,
Right.
what job you get, what internship you get. So yes, the economics play into it, but I think it's more than that. I think if we just put on economics, we're missing the whole culture of success as we define it in legal education.
Susan.
Karl Barth has this phrase I really like where he says, whoever lifts their hands in prayer to the Lord lifts their hands against the disordered injustice of the world. We heard about a great example of a guy who wanted to learn about wisdom and law and prayed to the Lord and worked out a case for Solomon. What is the role of prayer in shaping students towards justice? What prayers should we be teaching them to pray? How do you teach people to pray with respect to justice?
Wow. Okay, I'll start. I think the most important thing is a daily time with God, every single day, for every student that, wants to do what God has planned, the great adventure God has planned for them. So, and that's why I think law professors discipling students is so important. Mentoring, you could call it, but I really think it's discipleship. And when you can train some of the top people, right now I have a discipleship group and it's all law review women. And women that are leaders in other areas, and they just want to make a difference, but they're also at the top of their class, so they're exhausted. But the key thing is helping them to have that daily quiet time with God, so reading His Word and praying. I don't teach them how to pray, but I give them examples. We pray together, stuff like that, so I think, and then I have to do all that too. If I'm gonna hope that they do that, I better do that every day, and pray for them, and we pray with each other. So I think it is, the sky's the limit, Eric. Sky's the limit.
Can I say one thing?
Part of it may be learning a better understanding of the prayers we pray all the time. I mean, just last week I was reading a book, and it said the phrase, "Give us this day our daily bread." We tend to envision that in individual terms, give me this day my daily bread, but it's a corporate prayer. And so part of what you're praying for is that God would feed feed others. And part of the responsibility you should feel is helping that to happen.
There's a great, so one of the things I do with my third years before they graduate is go through some books and sort of helping them to think through what it's going to be like being a Christian lawyer. But one of the things we do is talk about prayer. And particularly we talk about prayer as agency. So C.S. Lewis has some great stuff discussing prayer as agency. And also there was a great article by Philip Yancey in First Things. But, you know, if you believe that prayer actually matters, that just like you do justice work by going to India, that you also have agency in prayer, so that your prayer really matters. It's equal to your action. Then you're just much more motivated to pray. So in the last 10 years probably, I've been trying to get a hold of that idea, and it just has transformed my prayer life.
How often do we say, well, I can't do anything but pray?
Right.
And that undercuts.
Yeah.
what
That's
you said.
And I've tried to make it a practice to pray the Psalms daily, and one thing you'll notice if you go through that on a systematic basis is how justice just appears in virtually every psalm.
Right, yes, that's true. Susan?
I think in moving corporations, the lawyer really is one of the few people who's there to say no and say, you know, the system has got to work, justice. So you want to cut justice, you go to a corporation. I mean, almost everyone else has their motivations, whether it's making money or whatever. But the lawyer, when they get a problem given to them, you know, basically they're the ones who have to say, you know, you can't do this. That was your lawyer. And I think that's something that, you know, this conference is great at.
Yeah, that's a great comment, in part in response to Devaney's question about litigation, because, I mean, what lawyers do in court is important for justice, but what lawyers do in the counseling role with clients is probably far more important. If you look at the things that happen because a lawyer has said, either the law doesn't allow you to do this, or you shouldn't do this.
Can you get that millennial up there?
I will. Susan?
I was just going to comment quickly. I think that one of the difficult things, at least for me when I was going through law school, even here at Pepperdine, was that one of the major players in what you do and how you make your decisions about what externship to take or what job to take is going through and coming from career services, which is a great and well-intentioned, obviously a necessary part of the law school. But there's also some decidedly mixed motives in that, you know, you want to get people in the right job, you want to have the economic framework there. And so I wonder if there's a possibility to have some component of that that is intentionally separated from the economics to help law students think through the justice issues. Because, you know, if you know ahead of time what you want to do and how kind of what your career goal is, they're great at helping. But if you're looking and you're trying to work through what is my part of justice, what is my field that I'm really supposed to work at, sometimes the tools and the frameworks that exist just aren't there and aren't connecting like in the same way. So I don't know a solution for that, but
We got one. How about the course?
So we talked about the lawyer-client counseling relationship. I think the law professor-law-student counseling relationship is something that that could be worked on. And some of us at Pepperdine and St. Thomas and Regent have been involved in a professional formation project, and we're learning a lot. Maybe Nat, take like 1 minute.
I know we're out of time, but one thing I want to say is that you've hit a very important point. There are institutional pressures to probably place you in certain places, actually, that may not be in your complete self-interest. And so that I think you're very wise in sensing that. And that's where we have to be honest with who we are as professors and institutions and take it very seriously, our role in advising you. One quick thing I'll say, we are starting a course next year that's going to talk about some of these things, but I direct our advising program at Regent, and we require our faculty advisors to talk with the students. They actually have a list that they're supposed to check off when they meet with their advisees to talk about professionalism and career counseling issues so that you're not just hearing that from the career services office, but you're actually having discussions about that with your faculty advisor. So that's one way we try to address it, but there are lots of ways to address it. It's a great point.
And with that, we're going to have to call the conference to an end. I want to thank you all for being such great participants. I feel like I've learned a lot in the conference. Just a few footnotes. The name tags that you've got, we would like to recycle those. Maybe just as you leave this room, you could put them on the very back of the back row, and we'll have somebody pick them up. And maybe we'll just leave your name in there, and then next year when you come to the conference, we can recycle your name. And then a second thing, this brings the conference to an end. We don't have a dinner planned. In your materials there, for those of you that might have cars and might be here for the conference, are some suggested restaurants that you might go to. But anyway, we'll see you next year. Next year's con.